Do you have back pain? If so, are you aware that simply sitting, even with good posture and a good chair, can be the cause of that? Today we're going to look into how and why that's likely the case, and why Westerners, especially Americans, have far more back pain than anybody else, as well as what exactly you can do about it. Now, if you look at the history of the world, it's quite interesting to note that we've only been sitting in chairs for about 5,000 years. One of the earliest stone chairs dating from 3200 BC in Scotland, and the earliest recorded images of chairs from about 2800 BC in ancient Greece. Subsequent physical specimens from ancient Egypt still survive, many of which look surprisingly modern, like this one from the Met. Now, although 5,000 years might seem like a really long time, if you consider the fact that modern humans, Homo sapiens, have been around for roughly 300,000 years, then that 5,000 years of sitting in chairs only amounts to about 1/60th of humanity's total existence, and that's only if you ignore all the other earlier hominids that we likely evolved from. In other words, the habit of sitting in chairs is only a tiny blip on the timeline of human history. And even during those last 5,000 years, sitting in chairs was by no means ubiquitous. For example, the ancient Romans ate their meals while lying down, something they have been mocked for in modern times as an indication of their decadence, but which, as you're about to find out, was not so crazy after all. Likewise, according to A.C. Mandal, the average Scandinavian did not have chairs in their homes until about 200 years ago, using benches instead before that. So, before chairs existed, how did people sit? Well, of course they could have sat on rocks or stumps and logs, but what is more likely is that they sat in a manner similar to that of many indigenous and native cultures today. That could involve a sort of crouching or squatting posture, which we see throughout the world, or as a cross-legged or yoga position on a cushion, used both in Asia and the Americas, as well as reclining positions on the ground. Now, contrast that with the fact that we went from a society that did almost no sitting in chairs to one that sits in chairs most of the day, either through sedentary work, driving in cars from place to place, or just sitting around at home, reading, relaxing, and while eating meals. Now, why is this important? Well, statistically, around 23% of people in the world today suffer from back problems. But in the USA, it's more than 80%, which is pretty insane when you consider the advanced medicine, technology, and healthcare that we have as compared to those other financially deprived countries. In my own case, when I developed various aches and pains over the years, especially in my knees and lower back, I was always surprised to find that these issues didn't seem to be connected in any way to one of my athletic activities, gym workouts, yoga, martial arts, or classical fencing classes that I was taking. Instead, they always seemed to pop up after a long day of sitting at work or driving in a car, which was a bit of a clue to me at the time. So why and how does sitting cause back pain? Well, I eventually got confirmation of my suspicions from two sources, which I want to give some credit to. One is my friend Ron Jones, who I interviewed on this channel, and who has a great channel of his own called The Lean Berets. The other is Dr. Ed Thomas, a physical culturist who runs a great channel called ViaMilitaris. What they clued me in on, and which I confirmed through additional research, is this. In the 1800s, Europeans and Americans became acutely aware of the back problem epidemic. They saw students slouching in chairs and laborers at work, and saw that it was causing these problems. So they tried to correct this through proper sitting posture. Unfortunately, this proper posture wasn't really sustainable for hours on end, so the sitters would repeatedly slump back into a so-called fatigue position, curving their upper back and neck in bad ways that would become permanent. Although the Victorians were on the right track, what they didn't realize, and what a vast majority of people today still don't realize, was that the chairs themselves were the problem. Chairs had been used in the West for so long, as far back as anyone could remember, that people just couldn't conceive that the chairs were the culprit. That changed in 1962, when someone you've probably never heard of, a German orthopedic surgeon named Hans Schoberth, used X-rays to discover that you can only bend your legs about 60 degrees in relation to your hips or torso without it affecting your lower back. In other words, when you bend your legs into the full 90-degree sitting position that almost all of us use, the lower back has to adjust for that remaining 30 or 35 degrees by bowing or flattening out, in what is medically known as a lumbar flexion or flattening of the lumbosacral curve. In other words, the standard seat or chair used throughout Western civilization forces one to adopt an unnatural, unsustainable position that will likely eventually result in long-term damage, as the vertebrae and cartilage grind together and wear each other down, creating the crooked old man posture. This is the very reason why school children tilt forward in their chair, an act which they are often scolded for. They are, consciously or subconsciously, trying to relieve the lower back stress incurred by the standard sitting posture. All of this info, and much, much more, was put into an extraordinary little book called The Seated Man, Homo Sedens, by the leading Danish surgeon Age C. Mandal. Unfortunately, this book is quite rare, and after learning about its existence from Dr. Thomas, I may very well have obtained one of the last affordable copies. But I'm going to share some of its findings here, which will hopefully be helpful and possibly even save your backs. So, what can you do about this? Well, it's interesting to note that some other cultures have already solved this problem in their own way. Years ago, I trained with a Japanese Zen master from the Soto School of Buddhism in Western Massachusetts, who would sit in meditation all day long for 5 to 7 days straight, a sort of meditation marathon known as sesshin. So this Zen sitting posture had to be healthy and very sustainable, otherwise you would literally destroy your body doing it. But my Zen teacher, as well as all the old Zen masters in his lineage, had perfect back posture well into old age. In this treatise on their tradition, as you can see here, one notices that all the various seating postures recommended have the upper leg sloping down at 60 degrees, whether sitting on a zafu cushion or in the seisan kneeling position. For people unable to do those, there is even mention of a position in a chair of which it is noted, quote, "This is more difficult because it is harder to settle into a stable, upright posture in a chair. Sit with your knees slightly lower than your hips or on a cushion if necessary." So here we clearly see that the old Zen masters knew not to ever use the 90-degree sitting position for extended periods, and to have the hips elevated above the knees. In my own time and culture, that of the West, we do have an equivalent to that, which is sitting in a saddle on horseback. In her classic 19th century treatise on posture, physical culturist Jessie Hubbell Bancroft uses examples of Native Americans sitting in the saddle, as well as General Lafayette, as examples of perfect posture. Some perceptive Europeans of past centuries also figured this out. During the 18th century, some chairmakers experimented with a reverse saddle seat, such as the cockfight chair and this library chair, where one's chest would face the back. Writers such as Carl Linnaeus and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe also developed saddle-like chairs, which allowed them to take the healthier horseman's posture, and these seats can still be seen in museums today. And some working-class Victorians figured it out as well. Old horse cabby seats, for instance, sloped forward, producing a less pronounced bending of the hips when sitting upright. Potters, organists, and weavers also often sat in seats that either slope forward or are very narrow. Unfortunately, however, these ideas never fully caught on for the masses. As Mandal stated in 1981, quote, "Modern furniture in schools, factories, and offices is constructed in such a way that no one can use it properly. Each day people sit for many hours hunched over their tables in postures extremely harmful to the back. No one should be surprised that more than half of the population today is complaining of backache. In no other field of human activity is a similar gap between theory and reality found." And later, in 2007, quote, "Despite the frequent occurrence of backache, our sitting habits have elicited strikingly little interest among doctors." In many ways, it's like the cultural phenomenon of smoking. King James warned against its dangers in 1604, and many holistic-minded people knew it was bad for you in the 17 and 1800s. But due to some sort of cultural inertia, their warnings were disregarded, and doctors even continued to smoke and recommend smoking throughout the 20th century.
Tens of thousands of doctors in all parts of the country, in every state of the Union. Doctors in every branch of medicine were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?"
It wasn't until the 1960s that we finally got a Surgeon General's warning, and not until the mid-1990s that American states began banning smoking in restaurants. It literally took hundreds of years despite the frequent warnings. And right now, the West seems to be stuck in a state of almost total oblivion about the seating epidemic. So what can you do about it? Should you go throw all your chairs into the garbage and start sitting only in a lotus posture? Well, probably not. If you are only sitting in those chairs occasionally, they're not a big problem, and if the chairs are high, then adding a sloping cushion to them, like the old cabbie seats, or as done in Soto Zen Buddhism, will probably improve them significantly. A.C. Mandal recommended a number of types of kneeling chairs, which created a sloping of the upper leg, and wherein one's knees take the bulk of the weight, thereby allowing for a balanced spinal posture. Likewise, some companies today produce ergonomic saddle chairs. Whatever you do, there are 3 important points to keep in mind. 1. The seat should be high enough and shaped so as to allow the upper legs to slope down at least 30 degrees. 2. If possible, the desk or table in front of the chair should be inclined, like an antique desk or a drafting table, to prevent forced hunching, which is terrible for the back. 3. And this is something that comes from my own personal experience. When I used to work long hours in a cubicle, in which my legs were forced to remain parallel to each other, I would often develop knee pain. The same thing would occur after driving long hours. When studying physical culture, I noticed that almost all stances and movements have the knees and feet oriented at 90 degrees to each other, whether standing still, squatting, or lunging. It seems clear to me that this open hip position, which is of course also used in Eastern sitting positions, is the healthier, more sustainable one as far as knee health is concerned. So I would personally avoid any chair or seating scenario which channels the knees into a more parallel position, such as what one is forced to take while driving. I hope you found this video helpful. In case you'd like to know more, I'll put a number of links in the video description below to important articles and to the individuals that I've mentioned in this video. Thanks again, and have a great day.